Sometimes life doesn't go as we planned. Anybody here notice that? Sometimes there are things in our life that contradict what we believe about our lives, what we believe to be true, and we wrestle with things, and we struggle with things. Sometimes we can't even make sense of these things. Would you agree? And I was inspired by Jim Kennon's conversation with us last week, and I was scouring through the Bible, and some of the wisest words ever written were written by a man named Paul to some friends of his who were going to church in Rome thousands of years ago. In understanding some of those struggles in life, Paul writes this letter to these people, and he says these words that almost get me tongue-tied when I read them, but if you pop those up there, Judah. Romans chapter 7, Paul says, "For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do, this I keep on doing." Paul's saying, hey, what is it about life that while I think I'm a pretty good guy and I want to do pretty good things, I kind of keep tripping over myself. I come up against things and I don't want to do them, and I find myself doing them, or I say, here are things I do want to do, but I can't seem to get myself to do, and that's a whole lot of doo-doo for a pastor to say on a Sunday morning. And Paul's basically saying, I've got these struggles in my life, and I can't make sense out of some of them. And I'm telling you this morning that I got these struggles in my life, and I can't make sense out of some of them. That there are things about my life that I say I want to do and I don't seem to get around to doing. There are things in my life that I say I do not want to do, that I want to avoid, and somehow I keep tripping over myself and doing those things. And I would bet that the Apostle Paul and Pastor David Harris aren't the only ones who struggle with things like that in life. So I think maybe the most important thing I can do in here this morning is level the playing field, okay? So, like for instance, when Tammy and I have these conversations and we start getting in an argument, I know that there's a boundary I can go up to, but I can't go beyond that boundary. Any of you husbands know what I'm talking about? And I know the one thing I can never say, no matter how irritated or true it might be, is this: you're just like your mother. Yeah, ixnay on the mother, right? I can't go there. And yet, every once in a while, the ugliness in my heart that I don't want to do comes out, and I find myself saying those words. But we do those kinds of things in other areas of life. You know, walked in here this morning, unlike last week, there's a thing of donuts down there. We say we're not going to eat the donuts. We say we're going to get healthy. We walk in here and we grab the donuts. If you were here last week, that makes a whole lot more sense to those of you who weren't here last week. Or we go to take our children or our grandchildren to Chuck E. Cheese. And we say, you know, Chuck E. isn't exactly a svelte little rodent because he's been eating Chuck E. Cheese. So all I'm going to do is eat salad. And they bring out the Chuck E. Cheese pizza. And the next thing you know, you're scarfing it down and it's all gone. So to level the playing field in here this morning, we're just going to do a mass confession. So if you have ever procrastinated when you said you were going to start on time, if you have ever eaten junk when you said you were only going to eat rabbit food, if you've left your desk in chaos when you said you were going to get it clean, if you've ever driven like a maniac when you said you were going to become a reformed driver, if you've ever exploded in anger when you said you were going to remain calm, if you've ever given in to the temptation that eats away at your soul when you promised yourself you were never going to, how many of you can say, my life is out of control? Let me see your hands. Sexually speaking. Oh, look at those go down so fast. Mass confession. It's good for the soul. Why do we do the things we say we do not want to do? Well, this is Romans chapter 7, verse 19. Now, here's my guess. I wasn't back there then. A few of you might have been, but I wasn't. And I'm guessing that after Paul wrote these words, he sat down for a couple of minutes and he thought about his life. He thought about his struggles. He thought about the ugliness and the grief and some of the idiocy. And he possibly even prayed about it. And then after writing verse number 19, he did all that before he wrote verse 20, because in verse 20 he says these words, "Now if I do what I do not want to do, it is no longer I who do it, but it is," talk to me, sin living in me. Now here's what I want you to understand. In writing those words, Apostle Paul was not abdicating responsibility in his life for the choices and decisions that he made. What Paul was doing is he's saying, no matter how good of a man I want to be, no matter how much righteousness I implore God to impart to me in this human condition, there is something inside of me that is more cunning, more powerful, more deliberate, more mysterious than I can begin to get my arms around, and I can't fight it on my own. And it's this thing called sin. There's a quote by C.S. Lewis I found putting this conversation together. C.S. Lewis said, "No man knows how bad he is until he has tried to be good." And Paul's saying, I'm responsible for my choices and my behaviors. Nobody else. But as this relates for my trying to live a life of goodness and righteousness before God, there's a battle that wages inside of me that I can't fight on my own. And some of us in this room know exactly how that feels, right? There are things that tempt us way beyond the power of donuts. There are things that we wrestle with, things that we struggle with. And we want to overcome them. And sometimes we even get close. And so what we do is we say, well, I'm going to go to church. And I'm going to go into this church. But what's happened in the American church is the American church has become, this is going to sound really judgmental, so give me an umbrella of grace, but I'm going to say it on camera anyway. For those of you watching around the globe, and we have thousands of you who watch our conversations every week, when you walk into a church, somewhere between the point where you get out of your car and you walk into those front doors, we put on a mask so that we can walk in and we can pretend that we have it all together. And we sing these songs and we worship with a great band like this, and then we walk back out, and as soon as we're in our car, we take the mask off and go, I don't have to fake it for another 7 days. Am I telling the truth? And it's because there's this thing inside of us that is more powerful than we are, and yet we're still responsible for the behaviors that are produced out of that condition. Now, here's the question we all have to deal with. How? How do I overcome something I want to overcome, but it's more powerful than I am? The next few minutes, if you've got your worship notes, I want you to follow along. I want to walk you through 3 things real quickly. The first thing is this. We recognize that there are 3 stages to our struggle. And the first stage is this. Pop it up for us, if you would, Judah. Next slide for me. Oh, I forgot. Sin. We talked about sin. Sin is a disease of the soul, but then go beyond that. James says we want to get rid of all the filth and evil in our lives and humbly accept the word of God that has been planted in our hearts, for it has the power to save our souls. Now, that first line, do you see where it says get rid of all the filth and evil in your lives? Another translation says get rid of all sordidness, and then it says these words, the rank growth of wickedness. And what it's talking about is that this condition that gets into our lives, this sinful estate that we live in, that if we don't deal with it, what it does is it puts down roots and it begins to spread, kind of like spiritual cancer. And it overwhelms us. And we can't get beyond it And James says, get rid of it. Now, here's what's interesting. When James says, get rid of it, I don't do this very often, so tolerate me for just a moment. In the original language, the Greek language that the Bible, New Testament was originally written in, those words would literally read like this, but that just doesn't make good English. So, shed yourself of it. It's the same language that's used that when a snake sheds its skin and emerges fresh. It's like it's leaving this deadness behind and emerges fresh. That's the idea when James says, get rid of all the filth and the evils in our lives. That we've got to find a way to leave it behind. But the question is, how do we do it? So we're going to walk through those three patterns. The very first pattern is this. We have adopted a sense of superficial behavior. We have ingrained patterns of superficial behavior. These are things that we know we shouldn't be doing, and we start doing them anyway. It's maybe we say we're going to eat healthier and we don't eat healthier. Maybe we say we're going to drive more responsibly. We're not driving more responsibly. Maybe it's the kind of thing where as a parent, you find yourself watching too much Netflix or too much television, and you're not spending enough time with your children. You're not spending enough time parenting your children. Or maybe you're a student, you're spending too much time on social media, too much time on YouTube, and you're not doing as well in tests, and you need to start studying for your tests. All you really need is for somebody who cares for you to point that out in your life, and you go, oh, thank you. It was like a blind spot. I never really saw it. It was a superficial pattern of behavior that I'm wrestling with and I'm struggling with. Or maybe in a moment of weakness, you said something or watched something or smoked something that you shouldn't. And you don't need a lecture. You don't need to be spending 7 nights a week in a certain group. You just need somebody to say, hey, did you notice that about yourself? And what happens is in that moment, you have a certain degree of light that gets shed on it. And once light comes to it and you understand what's going on, right then and there, you can pause, you can do business with God, and you can spare yourself a whole lot of hurt, heartache, and trouble in the future. But the moment it's drawn to your attention, the moment light is shed on it, that's the time to deal with it. That's the time to say, hey, God, there's this thing going on in me. There's this rank growth of wickedness that I don't want taking root in me. It's just like a seed's been dropped, but it's not taking root. God, let's get this out. Let's deal with it, just you and me in this moment. Does that make sense? And if that's you this morning, even as I'm speaking, some of you are thinking about something this past week, this past month, that falls into this category. Deal with it today. You're going to spare yourself a whole lot of hurt and heartache and pain and struggle in the future. Now, for some of you, just having light shed on it is not going to be enough because it's no longer a superficial pattern of behavior. You have an ingrained pattern of behavior. When you have an ingrained level 2, next slide, Judah, ingrained pattern of behavior, this is where you start structuring your days around it, and you know it's not who you really are. You know it violates Scripture. You know it violates your basic values. You know, maybe you're sleeping with or living with someone you're not married to, and you know that doesn't honor God. You know that's not what His Word says. You know you're falling short of the behaviors you want to have as the recognized character traits in your life. And yet you continue to do it. Or maybe you say, I'm going to get out of debt. But the next thing you know, you're sitting in front of your computer. You're sitting on eBay or Amazon or Hotlook, and you've got your credit card out, and you're plugging that number in. Maybe you say, I'm not going to view that kind of material anymore. But you're home, you're by yourself, you're alone, the family's all tied up, and you find yourself going to things you shouldn't be going to. And you want it to stop. You wish it would stop, and yet there's a part of you that doesn't want it to stop. Now, for some of you, depending on what those behaviors are, maybe it's certain fears in your life, like if you're doing things as a single person you know you shouldn't be doing. Maybe it's the fear of loneliness. It's the fear of being rejected. If I don't do this, they'll reject me, so I violate my values to find acceptance. That gets ingrained in our lives. Am I telling the truth? Maybe you like the high, the feeling, the buzz of whatever that habit, that addiction, that behavior is. And you don't really want to do it, but you don't really want to stop doing it. And you seem powerless to stop in the moments that you wish you could stop. You really do want to get out of debt, but you really do like spending and buying and accumulating. Maybe you've got an anger issue. Maybe you have promised yourself time and time again that you're not going to scream at the kids, you're not going to yell at the dogs. And every once in a while you violate that and you find yourself in a moment of rage, and it's scary for you to think of what you can actually do if this continues, and you want to stop and yet you seem powerless to stop. You have an ingrained pattern of behavior, and you no longer can just have light shed on it. You no longer can have a friend or someone in your connection group say, hey, have you noticed this about yourself? And go, oh gosh, I wasn't really clear about that. Thank you for bringing it up. God, I'm sorry, and move on in that moment. Now you need more than just that. Now you need to own it. And you need to find one person whom you can trust with your secret. Because what you're afraid of now is being found out. And you need to go to that person, and you need to share that with that one person, not the whole world. One person. And you need to walk through it. And you need to say, I know this isn't who I am, and I know this isn't who I want to be, but I can't seem to consistently overcome it. And then you need some structure, maybe even some information, education, if you will, on how addictive patterns brought on by the temptations of our culture become ingrained in your life. But you're not going to break this one on your own. And if you can make that happen today, even before you walk back out those doors, you're going to spare yourself a whole bunch of pain, and a whole bunch of heartache, and a whole bunch of brokenness. But some of you are already beyond this. It's no longer a superficial behavior. It's no longer an ingrained pattern behavior. You've already moved to like a level 3 behavior, and you are gripped by addiction. The temptation is always before you. No matter how badly you want to give it up, you seem powerless to give it up. Some of you, this is your life. You go, and whatever your hurt, habit, hang-up is, you find yourself immersed in it. And then you know when you come to church and you worship that it's not right, and you tell God you're going to be different, then what you do is you go and you say, God, I'm so sorry. God, I will never do that again. God, I promise. God, you can strike me dead if I ever do that again. God, I love you. God, I honor you. God, I worship you. God, I'm sorry. Please forgive me. He forgives you. 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months, you do it again. And you come back over and you pray that same prayer of intensity. God, I didn't mean to say that. I didn't mean to do that. I didn't mean to watch that. I didn't mean to smoke that. I didn't mean to drink that. God, I'm so sorry. God, let's overcome this. God, forgive me. And God forgives you. And you thank Him for His grace. And then 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months. Are you tracking with me? And this one is greater than you. And whatever the issue was, we don't really know what it was. The Apostle Paul found him dealing with this kind of thing. And here's what Paul says, again, back in Romans chapter 7. If you go to the next slide for me. Paul says, what a wretched man I am. And then Paul is all overcome with the grief of his sin by yielding to temptation. And Paul says, who will rescue me from this body of death? Paul is struggling and he's trying and he's striving, but he can't seem to get beyond it. Something stronger than him. I have a friend who's a pastor in California, and he has a man in his church who's the curator of a very, very large zoo. And one of the major attractions of this zoo in California is this 13-foot-long king cobra. And this is one huge snake. They are one of the most venomous snakes on the face of the earth. It's also one of their largest draws. And twice a year, just like every other snake, this snake sheds its skin. Except this snake has a scar over its eye from a fight it got into, assumingly, before it became part of the zoo. And sometimes when it sheds its skin, the scale that covers its eyes, because snakes don't blink and stuff, they just have a clear scale. Sometimes that scale will get stuck from that scar and it won't come off. And they have to surgically remove it. Yeah, don't get ahead of me. And this curator of this zoo told my friend, he said, and recently this happened. And I got the call that the monster, as they call him, shed his snake a few days ago, and the scale didn't come off, eyes getting infected, and we've got to get in there. Now, there are very, very few people who are allowed to deal with the snakes, actually only 2. And so they get a team of people, and here's how it happens. The snake's over there in this thing, and they go into an adjacent area that has a wall with a door in between. And there are 5 people in that room. There are the 2 people who work in the reptile thing, and they stand on either side of that door, just a couple of feet away. And all they have are bird nets with little 2-foot handles. And their job is going to be to catch the snake. And then standing about 10 feet from the door is the curator of the reptiles, the man who's going to have the biggest job. And then standing just a few feet behind him, on one side is the curator of the zoo, on the other side is the veterinarian who's going to perform the surgery. And they say that the story goes that when they open that door, in just a few moments, the snake comes slithering in. And when he sees the 5 subjects standing there in front of him, he rises up so that he's looking at them eye-to-eye level. And he starts swaying back and forth. And it's almost like the adrenaline starts to surge through his body, and he starts hissing, and he starts growling, and then all of a sudden, with this malevolent rage, quicker than you can imagine, he lunges forward at the curator in the middle, and the curator is hopeful that the guys with the 2-foot bird nets can catch him, and they get it over his head, and as the snake's trying to fight through him, they wrestle him to the ground. And then the reptile curator's job is to get hold of the back of his neck, right behind his venom glands, and get a knee in without injuring the snake and hold him there. You know that thousands of people die every year from the snake bites of king cobras? Thousands. And then the curator of the zoo is called forward, and his job is to help get the vet the scalpel and whatever he needs. But before he does that, the curator of the reptile says, grab that roll of paper towels over there and set them in front of the snake. And when they do, the snake buys in and he starts screaming and chewing, and literally an entire roll of paper towels becomes filled with yellow liquid. At which point, somebody always says, do you know that multiple elephants die every year from a bite of a king cobra? No man could withstand a full-force venom of one of these snakes. And so just in case, we're draining his venom sacs. Finally, the vet comes down, and the vet takes his instrument. In just a matter of seconds, he scrapes the scale off, and then comes the most dangerous part. With sweaty palms and sweaty hands and all of the energy and adrenaline of that snake literally in his hands, the curator of the reptiles turns and he says, stand back, I have to let him go. And then he says these words, more people are bitten trying to let go of snakes than they are picking them up. More people are bitten trying to let go of snakes than they are in picking them up. It doesn't matter if it's debt or gambling or anger or pornography or drugs or alcohol or adultery or promiscuity. Once you have picked up that snake, it's harder for you to let it go than it was for you to pick it up. And it will almost always bite you in the process. You know, Barbara Brown Taylor is one of the great pastors and authors in the last several decades in the American church. Barbara Brown Taylor says these very, very wise words. She says, I'm convinced 99% of us are addicted to something, whether it's eating or shopping, blaming, or even taking care of others. The simplest definition of addiction is anything we use to fill the empty place inside of us that belongs to God above. Did you catch those words? Anything we use to fill an empty space inside of us that belongs to God above. She goes on to say that part of what's so difficult in coming to grips with the snake, with the addiction, is if I'm really serious about letting go of it, then I'm going to have to face that empty place deep inside me. We all wrestle with temptation. We all struggle with the snake. Now, while I'm talking, some of you are thinking about the scenarios, the snake in your own lives. But you're hearing my voice, but there's also another voice that's sitting on your shoulder, whispering into your other ear. And you're saying things that lead you into a sense of denial, if you will. Oh yeah, David's telling the truth, but you know what? What I'm doing, it's really not that bad. That guy 2 tables over, you know what he did last month? He's like, if I'm him, if I'm in the basement, this makes perfect sense. But I'm a few stages ahead of him. I'm a few levels up. I'm not that bad. And what do? We justify and we deny. We justify and we deny. Or maybe we take it a step further and we begin to say, well, I know that I've got this issue in my life, but it's just not the right time for me. I'll get rid of it at some point, and I'll deal with it. But I just took on this new job, and there's a whole bunch of stress, and my one kid just graduated, and she's a freshman in college, and I got so much in my life. I don't really have time to focus on this right now. I'm going to delay this until it's a little bit more convenient for me. And we've got all of these difficulties and all of these struggles, and we're wrestling with things in our lives that are greater than we are. And the longer we deny them and the longer we delay them, the more rooted the rank growth of wickedness becomes in our hearts, in our minds, and in our lives. But for those of you who are sitting here, and you're hearing my voice, but the other voice you're hearing is not the voice of evil. It's not the voice of ugliness. It's not the voice of temptation. It's not the voice of Satan. You're hearing the voice of love, of grace, of hope. You're hearing the voice of God. How are you going to do this? A couple of things. These aren't in your notes. One of the things you're going to have to do is you're going to have to acknowledge your own reality. Maybe even in this room this morning, before you walk out those doors, in the privacy of your own heart and mind, you're going to have to say, hey, God, I got hold of this snake, and I want to let it go. But every time I try to let it go, God, it bites me, and I pick it back up to keep from getting bitten to death. God, how am I going to do this? God, I can't do this on my own. I need your help. Acknowledge your own realities. And most of us, depending on whether it's superficial, ingrained, or just completely gripped with addiction, for most of us, it's going to involve the assistance of another person. We're going to have to let our snake be known. You know, James, we talked about him a few minutes ago. Here's what James says in chapter 5. James says, therefore, keep everything in your life hidden and wear your mask so nobody will find out. That's in the Bible, right? James says what? Confess your sins to each other and not judge each other, not point fingers at each other, but to do what? Talk to me. Pray for each other so that you may be healed, because the prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. James is saying, you're going to have to share your secret. And this is where it gets difficult for us. Because for some of us, the number one goal in our life, while we continue to try and fight the snake, is to keep our secret hidden, and we're scared to death of being found out. Folks, the worst thing that could happen in your life is not for your secret to be found out. The worst thing that could happen in your life is that your secret is never found out and you go to the grave, but the snake destroyed your soul. And you stand before God with a destroyed soul because you were never able to rid yourself of the sin. And sin, as we said earlier, is a disease of the soul. The worst thing in your life, folks, is not getting found out. The worst thing in your life is never getting found out, never sharing your secret, and having your soul destroyed, and you go to the grave with your soul destroyed to face Jesus Christ. That's the worst thing that could happen to you. And so whatever the fear is in your life, whatever it is that you're struggling with, if you're going to overcome it, for some of you, it's going to be because you had a relationship that mattered to you, and something got found out, and it ruined the relationship. It's going to be because you got caught up in a situation where you were compromising on a lot of things, and your employer found out you were compromising on those things. It's going to be because you got caught up in something that was gripping you, and it caused you legal issues. Here's the deal, though. All of this doesn't have to end in a crash and burn moment. You can choose how it ends. You're like, David, I have no idea where to start. What if I told you you are in the perfect place to start, because that's what church is? Now, let me qualify that. Some of you grew up in a church, well-intentioned as it could be, but similar to me, where church was not a place for you to confess your sins and pray with one another. Church was a place for you to put on your mask and pretend to be more righteous than you really were. But what if God brought you to Connect Church this morning on purpose, and you're not here by accident, because He wanted you to hear that Connect Church is a safe place for people who wrestle with sin to come and find hope and freedom. You see, over the course of my life, almost every Sunday morning, I've either sat in an office or stood in a hallway, I've looked out a window, and I have watched thousands and thousands of cars over the years come pouring into a parking lot, coming down a driveway, and here's what I know to be true. Every car has a driver. Every driver has a snake. I've got one. You've got one. You've got one. And you've got one. So what if church wasn't a place for us to promote our own self-righteousness, but church was a place for authentic people to come and wrestle with the grip of sin? And we call that church. But you're going to have to choose to step out of your secret and make your snake known. Some of you are going to have to choose to do that today. Here's the last thought. You are not going to do this, one, under your own accord, but secondly, in just one sweep of your arms. You know, Jesus gave some pretty wise words for folks who struggle with these kinds of things. Here's what Jesus said in the Gospel of Matthew. He said, "Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own." You see, there comes a point in time when you can acknowledge it and you can tell another person and you can name your snake, but there comes a point in time where you've got to own the responsibility and say, no more. And that starts in a moment of time. And here's the deal. You don't have to eliminate the snake for the rest of your life. You only have to eliminate the snake for today. And then when you get up tomorrow morning, you have to ask God for just enough grace, just enough strength, just enough courage, just enough of His divine help to eliminate the snake tomorrow. You don't have to eliminate it next week. You don't have to eliminate it in 2019. You just have to eliminate it today. See, in this room, it's entirely probable that there's a man who loves his family very much, pretty well thought of in his small group. But every once in a while, when he travels, finds himself laying in a motel room at night watching channels he'd never watch at home in front of his family. It's entirely possible that there's a woman in this room. You're very involved in this church. You pray in your small group, in your connection group. But every day, right before the kids get home, or everybody comes running in from their jobs, you reach into a hidden cupboard, and nobody knows that there's a bottle, and you put just enough in a glass to give you the courage to get through the night, and you hate yourself for it. You think, I'm going to stop it someday, but someday never comes. More than likely, there's somebody in this room who's involved in business, and lately you've been having more month than month, and you found that if you can just pad the expense report just a little bit, if you can just cut a few corners, there's just enough extra money to get you through and make up for the shortage. And you try to tell yourself you're not stealing. You pray that there are no legal ramifications that you cross that kind of a line somewhere. But the snake's got hold of you. There's probably a couple in here. You're involved in this church. You're involved in one ministry, student ministry, children ministry, small group ministry. You're involved. You're respected. You may even be one of our leaders. And when you and your spouse go home, basically, you're two people with a marriage certificate, but all you're doing is sharing a mortgage. You don't remember the last time you were physically intimate. You don't remember the last time you had a mutually encouraging, mutually respectful conversation. For all practical purposes, you're two divorced people sharing a mortgage, living under a roof, and that's it. And she's alone, and he's alone. And you can't let go of the snake. At some point in time, folks, whatever your snake is, you have to have the courage to name the snake. And depending on where you are in that continuum, you have to have the courage to reach out and ask for help. You know why this is so important? One of Satan's greatest tools is the tool of isolation. Because that other voice in your ear has convinced you that you're the only one who's dealing with this. Do me a quick favor. Take 3 seconds. Look around this room. You've just looked at a couple hundred people who are holding a snake of their own that they're scared to tell you about. Look up here. You're looking at a pastor who's got a snake of his own that he's scared to confess to you. At some point in time, every one of us has to name our snake. And by naming our snake to one trusted person or in our community of small group, we defeat the power of isolation that Satan is holding over us. I know a guy whose snake was the addictive grip of alcohol. His father struggled with it. His grandfather struggled with it. He's heard that his great-great-grandfather struggled with it. He and his wife were pregnant with their first child. It had been gripping his life since his early teenage years. He's now in his mid to late 20s. And he looks at his wife, and he looks at the pregnant belly and the baby that's going to come out in just a few weeks. And somehow in that moment, he asked himself, what kind of legacy do I want to leave that child that's going to bear my name in just a few weeks? Called a friend. They went and met with the pastor. He named his snake. He said it wasn't easy and it didn't happen overnight. But I was able to let go of the grip of alcohol. I was able to break an ingrained cycle of addiction that had marked my entire family tree for generations. But somebody had to stop and say, no more. That was 40 years ago. This man recently went to be with Jesus. And I can imagine that when he stood there and Jesus called his name, when he heard those words, well done, my good and faithful servant, parenthetically he might have heard the whisper, you weren't perfect, not by a long shot. But you're here. And you named your snake, and you broke the legacy, and you changed the cycle, and your children and your grandchildren have freedom that you never had because you said no more. Can you name your snake this morning? Here's what I'm going to do. I've asked Jeremiah to sing a song. We'll sing the whole song. I'm asking the Holy Spirit to speak to every one of us in this room. I have dealt for years with a king cobra called pride. It cost me a job. It's caused me some pain and some hurt and some embarrassment. Some of you have snakes not nearly as big as that. Some of you have got snakes 3 times the size of that. You don't have to tell the person sitting at your table. Can you name your snake in the privacy of your heart, in the privacy of your mind, and can you ask God for help? And if you don't know who to talk to, call the church office. We'll get you into a conversation with somebody who helps with these kinds of things. We'll get you to a counselor. We'll get you to some people who can pray with you. But why don't you talk to God for a few moments while Jeremiah sings this song, and then I'll come back and wrap this up.